everyone can hear me, right? Okay. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this panel. We have two speakers today. Our third speaker has unfortunately fallen ill and will not be able to join us today. So we'll just have a little longer time for discussion and for our very interesting presentations. So without any further ado, I give you the first speaker, Maya Tzidkiyahu, who is the director of Israel-Europe Relations Program at the Mitvim Institute, a lecturer at the European Studies Program at Tel Aviv University and at the European Forum at the Hebrew University, a former IASEI co-president, and a long-standing member of its board. Thank you, Maya. Maya will speak for about 15 minutes.
Thank you, Sarah, for the kind introduction. And what I'm going to present to you is only part of a paper that I wrote together with Meital Peleg Mizrahi. I see that this was not translated to English. It's a different language. And we wrote it in the framework of Mitvim. It's a research institute. It's a think tank. It's a do tank that has had a project about climate policy of Israel. And we were writing about EU-Israeli climate policy. And we were trying to assess a word that we couldn't translate to English, also with the help of English translators, nichsiyut. So there's equity, which is more fortune, and there's something like acceptability. To what extent is Israel an asset to the EU? And obviously, to what extent is the EU an asset to Israel? So we evaluated the EU climate policy, Israel's climate policy. Obviously, there's a big difference between the two. Israel is quite a failure in its climate policy. The EU is the most ambitious player in the world, very successful one. A bit maybe less in the last couple of months. We see the EU being a bit retreating from its very ambitious goals, climate goals. But nevertheless, Israel is a long distance from the EU's climate policy, and it has a lot to gain from enhancing its relations with the EU on those matters. So I'm going to present only very part of that research that was done with Mitvim. Yeah, so we are right now, it's a bit cool, it's a nice day, but we are all frogs sitting in a pot that is being slowly boiled, not even slowly, quite quickly. The Middle East and the Mediterranean is a hotspot. I think you all know it probably. It has already increased in its warming 1.5 Celsius degrees. And the prospects that if nothing changes, if the CO2 emissions and the other emissions continue to as undisturbed, then the world will not stop at the targets and the goals of 1.5 Celsius degrees, but will increase to 3 Celsius degrees. But 1.5 world Celsius degrees has already happened. Already we are above the 1.5%. I'll just move the zoom and you can see that we are at 1.54 by now. And we are projected, the world is projected to increase to 3 Celsius degrees, and the Middle East will be increased by 8 Celsius degrees by 2010. 21,000. So 2100 in 70 years from, more than 70 years from now. Which have devastating implications. We're already seeing longer and more harsh heat waves, the increase of the sea levels, the implications of on the agriculture, on fisheries, on tourism, or on economy will be harsher and harsher the further we go down in the past. There will be more floods also, so everything will be more extreme. And the effects on economy and the effects on our social fabric, and therefore the effects on politics and on the security, so stability and instability in this region will be very dramatic. And that is very much of concern to Europe, because we at the southern Mediterranean are the backyard of Europe, right? So, and what we actually see is across the Mediterranean, also happening at the north, actually to even greater extent. So the northern part of the Mediterranean, Italy, Spain, those countries, Greece, are actually experience even quicker droughts. And we've seen that since 2018, that rivers in Europe are decreasing in their water capacity and their ability to either cool nuclear plants in France, or have ships that carries goods in the Rhine, and droughts in Italy that don't allow the agriculture to function properly. Right, so actually Europe suffers from that, and Israel can be of use to Europe because we actually are leading in some parts of research about desertification, for example, and how to have agriculture in the desert. So there's some good stuff and bad. There's some opportunities and challenges like everywhere. So EU is a world leader in setting goals for stopping climate change, or at least decreasing the amount of increase in Celsius degrees. And it also sets policy and sets regulation. And here we can speak about the Brussels effect that Anne Bradford was researching and showing how it works. The EU is very effective in setting regulation that has wider implications on the world, on Israel, on the region. We can speak about the CBAM, the carbon legislation, the tax actually on carbon that Europe actually is going to, it's going to take effect in the next couple of years. And it's going to have a quite dramatic effect, both on some of parts of the economy in Israel, but even much more on Morocco and Egypt that have those industries that will be targeted by this legislation. So I will not really go into the Fit to 55 or 55 reduction of gas needs to reduce the greenhouse gases and CO2 emission, etc. By 2030, and the wish that by 2050 the EU will be balanced in terms of those emissions. But this is the Green Deal. This is part of the goals that were set by the European Union in its Green Deal. What I want to focus more is about the different tools that the EU has in its external policies that has to do with Israel, with the region, and it has a very rich menu or toolkit of incentives, of fundings, and also starting to use some sticks. Now, just a few words about the EU motives in actually setting this policy. First, we know that the EU is a normative player, right? It has its worldview on how our world, our planet should function and how it should preserve itself. And it actually has also political meanings, because the public opinion in Europe views this climate policy very seriously. We have green parties, unlike in Israel or the region, to that matter. So normative issues has also to do with politics and internal politics. It has obviously vast economic interest in setting itself as the competitive player that invent and also produce. It used to produce much more of the solar panels. Now China is producing, I think, 95% of the solar panels because it took the technology from Europe and is playing in an unlevel playing field. And now, just yesterday, I read a piece about the wind capacity, how Europe is going to subsidize the ability to have more wind energy, so as not to lose that capacity to China and to other factories. And there's other issues going on, like electricity cars. And so we see Europe much more assertive towards China in order to preserve its economic industry and its order to preserve employment. It invests a lot of funds in research and innovation. Right now, in the multi-financial framework of the EU for 21 until 27, 30% of the EU budget is devoted to green purposes. Europe also sees those goals as part of its attempt is to decouple growth from consumption. So we will perhaps consume less, but we will grow. We'll still have economic growth. And Europe has managed actually to do so. From 1990 until 2017, the EU was able to reduce greenhouse gases by 22%, but increase its economic output by 58%. So it's 2.14% growth a year. It's not a lot, but still you can grow, your economy can grow even if you decouple and you change your production to less, so it will be less with less emissions. From a political point of view, the EU wishes to be much more to set the rules across the world. But it does so until now. It did so much more internally than externally. And I was already speaking about security implications. The EU's interest is to have its backyard, the southern Mediterranean, as stable as possible, and to avoid instability here in the region. It wants to have energy security, and that has much to do, obviously, also with the Russian war against Ukraine. It wants to have strategic autonomy. That is Macron's vision. So it wants to be self-sufficient in many strategic items, not only energy. And one of the ways to increase regional stability is to help the region deal with mitigation and with adaptation to climate change. So let's go into the different tools that it has. So first is, many of them are internal, and I'm not going to deal with that because I want to deal with the external ones. But the internal has external implications. So the budget of the EU, most of it goes to EU member states, but 7 billion euros are devoted to green policy in the southern Mediterranean. So the neighborhood policy, the southern neighborhood policy. It has many internal programs, but the programs are also, Israel can take part in some of the programs, and the region, the different government, civil servants can actually also take place in some of the programs that has to do with the Mediterranean Sea, with the different other aspects of water, of climate, and there's a lot of, it's the major regional setting that actually allows Israel to meet its counterparts from Arab countries and to actually know what's going on in them, and to be much more aware of the dangers and the opportunities perhaps also there. Yeah, okay, so the EU also gives a lot of capacity building. If you're familiar with TAIEX and twinning, I'm not going to delve into that, but those offer Israel actually paid by the EU to have workshops, to have field trips to Europe to see how things are implemented there, etc. And the last two instruments, first is the European Investment Bank. So quite a lot of investments are done here in Israel from European funds. For example, the desalination projects in Israel. So 4 out of 6 desalination projects, and the biggest ones, were partly but majorly funded by the EU. 750 million euros were invested here, but also in energy, in renewable energy, and in investments on research how to do renewable energy. And the other one was the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So to pay, so that Israel would, if it exports steel or different chemicals or other industries that has to do with for their production, you need to use a lot of, you actually emit a lot of CO2, then you will have to pay a tax. and so that has economic consequences on those factories, on those industries, and not only on Israel, but also on Egypt and Morocco, mainly in this region. So from our research, what we saw that the EU hardly has any macro effects on Israel. It wants to be this normative player that affects Israel, and that Israel will adopt the climate law and will, adjust itself to the Brussels effects. But Israel is very, it's not high on its priorities, and it's just moving really slowly, and it's not moving very fast. The OECD actually had a report just a few months ago reviewing the climate policy of Israel. We are one place before the bottom of the OECD in our policy. We are really in the disastrous place. I think Turkey is the lowest, but I'm not sure who's. So the EU has very low effect on our macro. I mean, normatively, it has an effect on the Ministry of Environment Protection. Normatively, people in Israel would like to, some people in Israel, the people who are aware, would like maybe to join the EU goals or be much more ambitious, but the government as a whole is not. We do see the influence in the meso level, so in the mid level, and in a much more influence in the micro level. And I think that has to do, when we think about the EU and its impact in the world, this is its effect in the world. It goes through the Brussels effect. It forces, that's the stick, right? It forces countries to adopt EU regulation. Otherwise, there's economic implications on the export to the EU. And it uses its funding to have multiple, capacity building, and it does have an influence. So many of the regulations that the Ministry of Energy or the Ministry of Environment adopted were actually copied from the EU menu. So we do see the Brussels effect taking place, actually to a great extent also voluntarily by Israel. But when we come to the macro level, we just don't see it enough. And I will just end with one sentence that the EU has much more, is focusing much more, and I think it would be also make sense to us, on the G20 countries that are not part of that. So China, Brazil, or India, the big countries which their emissions is much higher. They are the focus of the climate diplomacy of the EU, and doesn't put a lot of emphasis on tiny Israel or other tiny countries. So I think we will see in the next few years a bit more of stepping up of this climate diplomacy by the EU, and also small states and neighborhood states will be more influenced by the EU.
Thank you, Maya, for this fascinating presentation. I think your presentation shows how the energy policy is like a mirror or a microcosmos of so many issues and things that are going on in today's global political scene. Okay, so our next speaker is Naama Barak. Naama is a PhD candidate at the European Forum at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her dissertation is on the formulation of the European Community's policy on the Arab-Israeli conflict during the 1970s. And it is being written under the supervision of Professor Gadi Hyman, which is with us here today, and Professor Eli Podet. She's a board member of the IASEI, and outside of academia has been working at Israel's leading English language news outlets for the last 10 years. Thank you, Naama.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And Maya, it's actually really great to speak after you, because it's been amazing to me to see the long running themes in European energy policy. And I focus on the 1970s and things like Europe's backyard and French autonomy and strategic autonomy in world defense is something that was already existing in the 1970s. What I'm going to show to you is part of my larger PhD dissertation. And now I'm going to focus on a framework called the Euro-Arab Dialogue, which was formed in the 1970s between Europe and the Arab world in economic matters. And I want to show that contrary to what's common in the literature, it was not a completely futile framework or failure even in Europe's relations with the Arab world. So a few words on the European community in the Middle East in the 1970s. The European community was formed in 1957, and by 1969, 1970, it decided that it wanted to be a political as well as an economic player. And the first test case for European foreign policy was chosen to be the Middle East. The EC, the European Community, had three main goals. One was the reduction of military conflict. Like Maya said, the Middle East is Europe's backyard. At the time, it was more in a Cold War setting, the Soviets and the Americans battling it out here. Another major goal was oil policy and oil security vis-a-vis the Arab world. And the third goal was to use foreign policy in order to strengthen European solidarity and integration. This has to do with the normative power Europe theory and European external relations. And as luck would have it, the Europeans decided they wanted to become political in 1970, and then came 1973, and a major shock to the region. There was the October War, the Yom Kippur War, and the ensuing oil crisis. And 1973 posed a challenge to all the goals that I just mentioned. It posed a challenge to European solidarity because all the 9 member states at the time of the European Community were scrambling to get bilateral oil deals with the Arab world, contrary to the integration that they were working on. It meant increased military confrontation or threat of increased military confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean. Of course, it wasn't great for its oil supplies. So the Europeans tried to deal with this crisis in 2 ways. One was the Brussels Declaration of November 1973, in which Europe for the first time acknowledged the Palestinians and not as refugees, as the UN Security Council Resolution 242 recognized them. That was a very big deal, and it was an attempt to appease the Arab oil-producing companies. That's the general opinion in the literature. And the other attempt to deal with this challenge was to establish the Euro-Arab dialogue, which is what I'll talk about today. So the EAD was a joint project between the European Community on the European side and the Arab League representing the Arab side to bring the two sides together. It carries on throughout the decade. It was formed in 1974. It worked properly until 1980, although meetings carried on as far as 1986. And it dealt with European aid and infrastructure to the Arab world, about the transfer of technological know-how, infrastructure projects, agriculture projects into the Arab world. And it really tried to avoid the two topics both sides were interested in. The Europeans wanted to guarantee their oil supplies. The Arabs wanted to guarantee the Palestinian question being brought to the fore. And both sides tried to stop one another from doing exactly that. So this point leads the literature to wonder what was the point of this Euro-Arab dialogue. This is why I say that my research is historical. I'm using archival material from the 1970s, from the British Foreign Office, from the Israeli State Archives, as well as some European Community sources. Here we have a short quote from the British Foreign Office about the EAD being perhaps the most ambitious common political undertaking for the 9. So again, this was an infrastructure that served all 3 goals. It was European integration because they came to it together. It tried to stop the oil threat from materializing, and it tried to reduce conflict in the Middle East. The European side of the EAD faced quite a few challenges. One was the Palestinians. The different member states of the EC at the time didn't have the same policy on the Palestinians. France, for example, in 1974 was already meeting with Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, while for other countries that was a massive no-go. In the matter of oil, the Netherlands was blacklisted by the Arab world for its support of Israel, whereas France and Britain were considered semi-friendly countries. The EAD also posed a challenge to Europe's relations with the United States. The Secretary of State in the US at the time was Henry Kissinger, and he was far from pleased with Europe taking an independent stance in the Middle East. And all this was happening while there weren't any actual tangible benefits for Europe in the Middle East as a result of this project. So again, the question arises as to why they bothered with it. And I think that archival sources have a pretty good answer. Here we have a short quote from a meeting of the British Secretary of State with Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger, as we see, thought that European political integration in general, and specifically the EAD, was based on a spirit of confrontation towards the United States. So it didn't set the best atmosphere. The main focus of my PhD is European integration and normative power Europe theory through European integration via foreign policy. So I focus on the challenges to European integration within the EAD framework. In European studies, there's the big debates that I studied with Maya. Is it intergovernmental? Is it supranational? And here we see them really thrashing it out, and the friction between the member states, each having their own policy, having to reach common decisions. France was like a vanguard in one point. Everyone else tried to stop France. France tried to get everyone on its side. And there were also different national policies on the Palestinians, like I mentioned, and different national policies in the US. Again, Maya mentioned before Macron's wish for autonomy. The French were really trying to go it alone, whereas Germany, this is the 1970s, Germany was heavily reliant, or West Germany was heavily reliant on the United States for its actual security, and that led to a whole scramble. Of course, there was also the danger, which is what the Europeans were trying to avoid of the Arab world, Israel and the United States, all trying to play off the Europeans once against another. The Europeans understood that their strength is in being together, but this holding themselves together was the main challenge, and the different parties tried to undermine that. Now, the literature is in agreement that the economic successes of the EAD were not massive. It never came to much, bar a few projects. But it's important to note that the EAD, despite being a purely economic framework, was a political, its inception was political, and I think that's why its successes and failures should be viewed through a political perspective, not an economic one, which is really less than impressive. For the Arab side, there were quite a few successes. One was the unprecedented cooperation with Europe. These are countries, for example, Algeria, only a decade beforehand, it was a colony. Now it was sitting at the table as part of the Arab League, negotiating with France. That was a huge thing. So we see previously imperial relations shift into more modern ones based on mutual needs. Despite the fact that Europe really tried to avoid the issue of PLO recognition, that was also addressed via the EAD. In the 1975 Dublin formula, which saw PLO participation as part of a larger Arab delegation. And this, the EC wouldn't formally acknowledge the PLO until 1980, the Venice Declaration. This we can see how these sort of machinations went through the EAD and how it laid the groundwork for that sort of thing. And the Arab-Israeli conflict was brought up by both sides. Initially, the Europeans really tried to avoid it. By the end of the decade, each meeting of the two sides opened by speeches about the Israeli-Arab conflict and how it should stop and how Israel should leave the settlements, etc. So that was a political success. Here we have a quote about the EAD being all about mutual dependence and how it's a new era in world politics, especially as Europe was not a superpower and was kind of stuck in the middle. And I think for the European side, political success was also quite remarkable. It was actually the first time that Europe managed to form a concerted distinctive European foreign policy framework. This wasn't the declarations, the Brussels Declaration, the Venice Declaration, the London, which were kind of ad hoc and often based on the lowest common denominator that everyone could agree with. And here we have decades-long work coming together. Europe also managed to stand in the face of US pressure. At first, Kissinger was really livid about this taking place. So Europe managed to show both independence and to keep good relations with the United States, with Washington. At first, it didn't seem that would be the case. And of course, it became a player on the international world stage. It was recognized as a regional power, both by the Arab world, by Israel, and by the United States. And it kind of put itself out there. So I think in concluding, again, this is the sort of framework that has been written off in the literature, as much ado about nothing. I think that if we come to view this framework in a political prism, then that's not so accurate. We saw the Europeans overcoming threat to their integration, despite a very shaky start. We saw a distinctively European position on the world stage. Stronger relations with the Arab League, again, decades of relations. I don't know to say whether this thwarted the oil threat that Europe was so concerned with, but it must have helped. There were interpersonal relations before in the introduction, we had about institutional ties and overcoming difficulties. I think this is another example. There was a better coordinated Palestinian policy, which was thrashed out within EAD before being brought forward via declarations or in the UN voting. And there was certain policy independence vis-a-vis Washington, which was very important for Europe at the time. And thank you, that's all.
Thank you so much, Nama. Thank you to both our speakers for being so punctual with time. I think we will now open it up to questions. Maybe we'll take a round and then give our presenters time to respond. So don't be shy. Okay, maybe I'll open it up and give people some time to process what they've just heard. So, Maya, my question to you, sorry, I wrote it down as I was listening to you. So you mentioned how Europe is able or was able to maintain growth on the one side while reducing emissions and damage to the environment on the other. And then I was thinking, so it must be on the, I mean, something it has to come at the expense of something. So is there any type of trade-off? For example, Europe has been a leader on the issue of labor standards. So is there less attention being given on workers' rights and social standards in industry, or maybe a strengthening of the Fortress Europe perception? Maybe Europe is becoming more closed towards its neighbors, towards foreigners knocking on its doors. So what is the trade-off of maintaining growth while reducing damage to the environment? And my question to Nama, this is a bit of an unfair question, but I have to. I think it's required due to the timing and circumstances. So you've spoken a lot about the link between energy and the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So how do you see this unfolding in what is today being so high on the public discourse of the day after? So what is, can you deduce anything from your research to what is going to happen on the issue of energy between Israel and the Palestinians and external actors based on your research? So I'll give you time to answer, and maybe this will stir up a bit of discussion.
Okay, so first I'll have to admit that I'm special to EU issues and EU-Israeli relations, but I'm not a specialist on green issues or environmental issues. This was Meital's role. But I think Europe presents itself as being able to decouple economy and consumption from and growth from reducing and while being able to reduce its emissions. But it does have a price on growth, and Europe is not growing so fast as other places in the world from economic perspectives. I'm not sure everything has to do, probably it's only a slight part of the answer why Europe is growing to a lesser extent. But I think there are two issues that I would like to raise. First, there's the short and medium range, where you pay for all those huge investments that are required to make you a bit much more renewable and to actually being able to operate circular economy and all those issues with the long-term gains that you're supposed to have. And so that is one thing. And so we need to think about the framework of time in which we examine those things. I'm not sure it was at the expense of labor standards or Fortress Europe. Not at all. I don't see the relation. I think Europe was trying to do both. And actually, the Green Deal is both a climate, setting a goal for to fight climate change, but at the same time, it's a huge investment program in Europe's economy. So actually, what Ursula von der Leyen in its program was trying to do, to have them both, to show that growth can come with a lot of investment and to actually help the economy, the European economy by huge investments. The other comment, so I'm not sure that they actually conflict. And the other issue that I think that has to be addressed by economists, and I'm not an economist, is how do we measure GDP, or right? How do we calculate all those negative influences that we usually don't calculate as part of the how do we calculate the damage of climate change? How do we calculate all the damage of floods and fires and damage to tourism and to economy and whatever? And this is on the economist's role to do. And once we'll have the equations much more inclusive to all those phenomena, I think we'll see Europe in a better place of being more resilient and more able to face those challenges.
Thank you.
A super interesting question. No idea about the day after, but I think there are some similarities that we can see. We see that like 40 years ago, 50 years ago, we see Russia supporting the Arab tribe. We see Russian, I don't know if support of Hamas, but anti-Israel for certain. The United States clearly coming out in support for Israel. We do have a new twist in the form of the Russian oil crisis and the Ukraine war, and that having its impact. And I think what does come to the fore is that EU normative power and foreign policy on the Arab-Israeli conflict is less than impactful. It's normative, but in reality, it won't change much. We saw Josep Borrell coming, touring around Kibbutz Be'eri and making these declarations. Doesn't matter, does it have an impact? I don't know. Would Europe like it to have an impact, certainly for internal as well as external reasons? So I do see a lot of similarities. I think we once again seeing this kind of a bigger world game being played in the Middle East, and we shall have to see what happens.
Thank you. Yes, Gadi, I think we'll collect and then we'll give it to you.
Okay, so I have two questions. The first for Maya, how do you explain the difference in commitment between Israel and EU regarding the climate change issue? Because, well, you can see a lot of similarity between the two entities. Well, in development level, in normative values. So if you can elaborate a little bit about that, how you explain, how you see the difference, the huge difference between the two entities. And Nama, you know that we have a tendency in Israel to see the, let's say, the pro-Arab orientation of Europe from the 70s are mostly explained by energy considerations. And you are you have a window into the policy makers' consideration at that time. How you will evaluate the weight of this consideration? There's the more normative consideration in the issue.
I think we'll collect and then we'll give you a chance to respond.
So I also have one question or 1.5 questions as well. So talking about the European funding, I was asking myself whether these are like, if they are officially from the from the European Union, are they bound to some kind of commitment? Is it like it seems a little weird to me that the EU usually they're just giving out funds when they get something in return. And if Israel is just saying, okay, we're taking some, but we're not giving any commitment, no, I don't know, whatsoever, that seems a little odd to me. And on the other hand, there's some, like maybe you can just, because I'm wondering, like also before you talked about it, there's some really good projects in Israel that seem to not go forward. There's this huge energy plant in the Negev that you can see for, I don't know, dozens of kilometers. And why aren't, like, it's so, when you're talking about 8 degrees more in 76 years, it would be a huge potential for solar energy. Why isn't there a second, a third, fourth one? And instead, Israel is still importing coal, like literally coal on ship. It just doesn't make sense to me that this is economically, that this is a good trade-off. And my other question is that I thought about the COP28 and some other like formats where very heterogeneous groups are having discussions on, I don't know, ambivalent topics. And so here we have 2 very heterogeneous groups where, as you said, for example, Algeria and France were sitting on a table. And so did they have some kind of final declarations after their meetings? Did they have like something? Usually it's getting very difficult as soon as people have to agree on something. They can talk for hours, but then like in the end, what was coming out of it? Did they say, okay, now we, I don't know, have a plan for the next 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, something?
Great, go ahead, Maya, please start.
Really good question. So I'll start with Gadi. Why is Israel so different about its climate commitments or goals? I think the main issue is there is no political pressure from public opinion. That is the one main reason. So there is no political incentive for politicians. We had Alon Tal coming from here as a member of Knesset, and other than that, no Green Party was able to really win votes in Israel. We have other very pressing security matters, and that takes it all. It takes a lot of investment in order to be able to produce more solar energy, for example. It needs much more civil service capacity in removing regulation that stops this solar energy from taking place in Israel. And we are one of the top 10 countries in the world that has the potential of having solar energy. And we are lagging behind Jordan. We are lagging behind Morocco in producing solar energy. We don't have enough ground. So there's this really ambitious and almost took place agreement between Israel and Jordan that Jordan would use its land to produce solar energy. It would sell that solar energy, renewable energy, to Israel. Israel would sell Jordan desalinated water, because Jordan is very much suffering from lack of water, as many other countries in the region. Israel, I think about 70% of our water are desalinated. So we are in a different place, also due to EIB investments here. So what I do see, there's a big potential of regional collaboration. That was another part of my research that I didn't have the time to present. We have the opportunity to take this as a security risk. I will say that 2 years ago, there was a shift in the way that the Prime Minister's office viewed climate change. And suddenly someone ticked the box there that it's a security risk. It's a security regional risk of instability due to water scarcity and food security issues. And also in Israeli terms, right? So once you tick the box of security, then suddenly people are a bit more willing to discuss it and to invest time and effort in that. But then we have the urgent security issues, and that takes everything. So we need to frame it differently, perhaps in Israel, in order for it to be more engaging for politicians and for public opinion as well. We are not on the same normative place as Europe at all when it comes to climate issues. And also on other issues, I would say, we are distancing ourselves, but also Europe is moving to the right, so, but that's a different political debate. Funding, excellent question. Why there's no conditionality? You would expect the EU to have conditionality. It doesn't have. It's a gift. You persuade people to do projects by the sheer power of persuasion, because it's for their own good interests. So Israel, to a great extent, and other countries in the region, sees the EU as a wallet and uses the tax-paying payers' money of Europeans for our own benefit without going a few more steps further, okay, without such conditionality.
But the money for the salination plant from the EIB, it's not a grant. It's
No, most
part
of it's not a grant.
financial
I'm not,
so it's not a gift.
but I'm not speaking about the EIB. I'm speaking about TAIEX and twinning,
Okay,
and
but
you know
that's
those.
money. It's little.
That's small money because Israel only receives 10% of the total budget that is allocated to the southern neighborhood. But when you speak about Morocco or Egypt or Algeria or Tunisia, then the big sums are there. And why there is no conditionality? Because the EU is very weak, because the other member states, the non-member states, are able to play different political games, and it's part of the weakness of the EU that it doesn't use enough conditionality. With some countries, it succeeds much better. Morocco sees a big opportunity with its relations, economic relations and climate relations with the EU. And actually, I think it has already signed a green partnership. And there's really good reinforcement of both sides. But Israel doesn't, since it's not high on its agenda, it just doesn't take the many opportunities that are offered by the EU to Israel. It's just not high on our agenda.
That's a little follow-up, because it was just, I'm just wondering, you said that there's not enough space. And I think like it's not the most, like, I don't know, expansive building in Israel. It's just, and then it seems to me that there is some space in the Negev to build a power plant. The question is like, of course, in Morocco, there are way less people on vast, I don't know, countryside where nothing is. But there's this huge potential of green hydrogen that the EU is like focusing on right now. And is this a topic in Israel, like not just in connection with the EU, but like in general, to have green hydrogen, which is like the big thing everywhere. And I think Israelis are pretty much up to date what technology is about and what the potential of the future and energy security and stuff. And since the connection to all of the Arab countries is always a little bit volatile, it's yeah.
So when you speak about research, Israel is that's probably the edge that Israel has and can give to the EU, right? So one of the recommendations is for EU and Israel actually to develop not a green partnership, but green innovation partnership, because this is what Israel can. This is the acceptability of Israel to the EU. But Israel found gas, right? And 75% of our energy is coming from gas. We stopped using coal. It's for reserve, I think, for security purposes, but we are using gas mostly. And therefore, you know, we can celebrate on both exporting gas, exporting to Egypt and to Europe, actually, since the Russia war in Ukraine. And other issues. So it's a matter of regulation in Israel. We should strengthen our relationship with Europe when it comes to energy, and on other things, it's just, you know, we have poor civil servants, and it's not to blame the civil servants, it's politicians. It's the priorities of the government, of all the governments that were here in the past years, decades.
Gabby, to your question about the weight of oil versus normative power, I entered my PhD thinking it's definitely about normative power. We can't have this whole theory about normative power Europe and it's all being about oil. The more records I read, the more I'm convinced oil has a bigger part in it. But I think that normative issues, do you have a stance if you look at normative power as global standing in European integration? These are European norms, because I think had oil had the biggest weight, then the European political cooperation would have broken up in the fall of 1973. I think that this wish for integration and to become this player on the world stage motivated European players, particularly France, to overcome their particular oil needs and move in a political cooperation way. As for final declarations, the meetings did have final declarations. The content of the dialogue was economic. So that was the easy part to talk about. We're going to invest so-and-so, you're going to do so-and-so. It wasn't anything breakthrough. And they did have political statements, and the Europeans, the Arab side, the Arab League tried to twist the Europeans to be more forthcoming in their political statements within the EAD framework. And the Europeans were really hesitant about doing it and really stuck to their guns, saying literally no more than what they'd said at the UN or in other declarations, or refused to have the EAD turn into a vehicle for public progression of their opinions. But it was definitely an ongoing struggle there for both sides. So there were some issues surrounding it.
So Arya raised his hand.
Yeah, I just want to comment on your question of why there's such a difference in political support in Europe versus Israel to green issues. And I agree fully with what you said. It has to do with security issues. Israelis are much more involved and worried about that and concerned. But I think there's something more here. I want to try to offer a sociological explanation. And so Europe is these days a very secular society generally, and liberal, which means that anyone can have all their views and everything, and there's a certain vacuum, there's a certain emptiness. And in recent years, we've seen that environmentalism has turned into some kind of surrogate religion. People believe in it in Europe and other places religiously, so to speak. Whereas in Israel and in other areas, we have our security concern. We have other things that fill it up, whether it's religion or Zionism. Everyone has their ideologies, and green issues are not as central to that, are less needed to fill up a vacuum that otherwise comes up in a very secular society. The society doesn't have any wants. We have everything, so we need something to live for.
I would say, Arya, that I disagree with secular liberal societies are hollow and are empty. I would disagree with that completely. But Europe is in peace. It doesn't have the security threat. And then it can, other issues can thrive. And then the climate issue is a security issue. It is a security issue for Europe, for when for all of us on the planet, right? But Europe is free to move forward and to concentrate. It has because of up till 2022, because it was so secure, I think it was able to devote such attention.
I didn't say that secular is hollow. I say that people need something to believe in, okay? And it can be a lot of different things. It can be green issues, it can be feminism, it can be democracy. People took the streets in Israel for democracy and for against the reform. They believe in that. People need something to believe in. You can't just believe in free markets. It's not enough of a value as much as I'm a free marketist, okay?
I agree with that.
Okay, so we have two more questions from the audience. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot of research on Eastern Germany because it's like one of the least religious places in the world since the reunification. We have more and more right-wing extremism, and people are like way more keen to follow conspiracy theories. For example, like there is this clear, I don't know, correlation. I don't know whether this is a causality, But I would ask whether the other way around, maybe if religious countries think that there is an entity savings well for them. And I think you could also ask this question whether maybe in Israel there are some parts of society that think that whatever they're doing in kind of a way that Israel would always be there. And I don't know.
It's a fascinating topic for further research, and I have no, I'm not a sociologist, so I'm not an economist and not any other things, but.
Ben, did you have a
Yeah,
question?
no, I got that, I mean, obviously climate is becoming the, I would say it's replacing, I would say the thing that brings Europe together today. Okay, so climate change is now the major, I would say, issue that keeps Europe in the way. Now, to what extent, you mentioned the external policy, the Green Deal that has been signed with Morocco, and that there are some in the pipeline. Do you see any possibility of an Israel-EU Green Deal partnership?
So I was considering that in my paper because I really wanted to suggest that as a policy recommendation. I see no feasibility for that in the near future until Israel will set its macro goals, its policy goals, and will have climate law, as OECD country should have, and actually stand to the goals that it sets. I don't see any green partnership. I do see a possibility for green innovation partnership, because that's what Israel has to give the EU, right? This research innovation, when you speak about climate tech, when you speak about food tech, agro-tech, so energy, renewable energy. So we are really good in researching, in inventing different things that would help fight climate change. We are not implementing them in Israel, but we can sell them to Europe, and we should.
So why don't you set a goal of a Green Deal partnership with Europe, and both for the Israelis and for the Europeans?
Because we are a
That
failed
way we can-
state in terms of climate. Why should the EU? Look, Morocco is very much advanced, and Japan is very much advanced, and those are the two countries that do have green partnerships with the EU because they are advanced. Because you have, the EU doesn't give partnership with countries that are failed countries in terms of climate change. So I think Israel has to step in if it wants to have this green partnership, but we need to put our house in order. We are out of order. We are one of the, the least OECD countries in those terms. It just,
We need to discuss it further, because I think that could become a fact of cooperation in a positive way.
absolutely. No, absolutely. I see a lot of room for cooperation, but not to the level that the EU would sign with Israel a green partnership. Not now. There's a lot of room for Israel to be to take more from the EU. And I hope the EU would use much more conditionality versus Israel, because I think we need some more sticks, like the carbon adjustment border mechanism, that we will have to adjust to. Otherwise, the industry would lose to a great extent in Israel. So I think the EU is moving to the direction of using those mechanisms that are much more conditionality, but it has actually a cost on our neighborhood. Because if that harms Egypt's economy, which is destabilized as it is for now, that is not a good result for the EU. And it hasn't taken the considerations when it had to do with Egypt or with Morocco. And we've seen what the Arab Spring can do to Europe also, and Europe doesn't want that, right? So in Europe, there was the just transition mechanism, and 100 billion euros were devoted to just mechanism for people who will be harmed from moving to renewable or to more friendly climate policies. But Europe doesn't have that towards its southern neighborhood. And I think one of the recommendations should be for Europe to actually see what does it do with those very sensitive industrial places that are going to be harmed by that.
Yeah, maybe to Naama, I mean, in my past history, I wrote about the EU dialogue in 1976. Now, I mean, there is a huge change in the Arab world too. Okay, so who was actually the major leader on the Arab side? Because at that time, the UAE and just got independent, and they were really just at the beginning. So who was actually the leader on the Arab side of that dialogue?
That's really interesting, and like you say, it shows geopolitics. I didn't mention that by 1980, the European community switched from the Euro-Arab dialogue to dialogue with the GCC, the Gulf, because it saw it more.
And to the MENA. So there was
And-
MENA and JKT,
and
but they separated the Arabs,
Exactly.
one with the money and the one without the money.
And also within the Euro-Arab dialogue, you see that the prominent Arab countries pressing for the Euro-Arab dialogue were not their oil exporters, because they had enough money. They could buy whatever technology they wanted from Europe. They didn't need an aid or development fund for that. So you saw the Arab League, which was headed, the Secretary General was Mahmoud Riyad, who was a big player. You saw Algeria, you saw Tunisia, non-oil exporting countries that couldn't get these European benefits. Saudi Arabia, for example, was disinterested also because it had enough money and enough oil, and also because it was very friendly with the United States, even back then, and it didn't want to anger the United States by cooperating with Europe when Washington was not that pleased with Europe. It was all very geopolitical, but the short answer is,
But the Saudis were on board.
pardon?
The Saudis were on board.
They weren't board, but they weren't the major advocates within the Arab League to do it. It was mostly Egypt. Also was the signing of the peace treaty with Israel. Then Egypt was isolated from the rest of the Arab world, and the Europeans wondered what to do. Do we talk with Tunis, the new head of the Arab? It was a lot of Arab geopolitics involved.
Okay, Maya, I have another question for you because you spoke about the,
Question for now.
okay, oh, so you go ahead first and yeah.
Okay, so I am much more interested in the Israeli perspective of those 70s. Why, I mean, one of the questions is why didn't Europe just go a few steps further with the Arab countries due to energy needs, etc., and sort of ditch Israel? What were the interests of the European community back then to try to be more, to not ditch Israel completely?
I think that has normative dimension. The European community was made out of 9 member states, and one of the major ones was West Germany. And West Germany couldn't afford to ditch Israel and wasn't interested in doing so. Also for its own internal reasons and also for its relations with the United States. So by not ditching Israel completely, Europe tried to remain on good terms with the United States and also with its own domestic public opinion. In 1973, the European street wasn't pleased with the Arab world. They had to cut down the use of cars and lighting, and they had a real crisis. So the policymakers on the one hand and public opinion on the other in certain countries, and they had to somehow find the middle ground for that.
So it was you mentioned the gas, which is kind of, was a source of an energy party and kind of holds back the development of green energy. So how would I think that the gas is more and more becoming a source of security threat as Hezbollah and Hamas missiles are targeting. So Karish and so this has been in the headlines in the current war and also in the past. So do you think, you said that when the security box is ticked, so that's when an issue starts to be prioritized. Do you think that can be a source of prioritization of green energy sources? Of course, if we put solar panels in the Negev, that could be targeted by Hamas as well, so.
Yeah, but it's harder to target, solar energy would be much more widespread. I'm not a security expert, so it's hard for me to give a good answer and reliable answer on that. I think Israel has its ways to actually, when you're facing a security challenge, to answer it in hard security manner. And in the long term, it should have an effect. And also, when you speak about gas reserves, right? In the long term, Israel should move to renewable energy. But in the short term, it has all those regulation issues that it doesn't seem to solve quick enough in order to fulfill its own targets that the government posts.
Any more questions from our audience? Okay, so we have a few minutes before the next panel to to have some coffee and freshen up. Please join me in a round of applause for our excellent presenters.